Well, comrades, I've got some news from Penguin Books. I won't use this if it plays up.
Use it near him. If you use it right here, it doesn't.
Use some Penguin Books. Can you hear? Is it working? I think it is. Which is that really, 1984 has been a tremendous year for the Orwell industry. I hear that from September the 1st last year to March the 1st this year, the Penguin edition of 1984 has sold 770,000 copies. That, comrades, is about 4,000 copies every day being sold in this country of that book. Since Penguin started publishing Orwell in the 1950s, 14 million copies of Orwell's books have been sold to people in this country, and that doesn't include what's been sold in America, where the figure is almost astronomical. The fact is that these books, particularly Animal Farm in 1984, have entered deep into the consciousness of people. There are lots of people, and maybe some here, although I doubt it, who've only read one book, perhaps only read one or two books over a period of years, and that is Orwell's 1984 or Animal Farm. They are really hugely selling books, which are very much part of the mass culture of the country. And our organisation has built up quite a close relationship with Orwell in spite of that. I mean, you'd have imagined that anything that was quite such a mass culture would be ignored a little by us, but that's not the case. Way back in 1969, I remember Peter Sedgwick writing in International Socialism, the first of what were to be two articles, but unfortunately were never two articles, which were entitled George Orwell, International Socialist, query. And that meant something more than what you might think it means today. What it meant was George Orwell, Socialist Workers' Party member, query. That's what it meant. And he, in fact, argued very powerfully, I think, that George Orwell does fit into the tradition of our politics and does come out of the same attitude to politics. You probably have read in a recent issue of Socialist Review a very good article by John Deason saying roughly the same thing. And in the current edition of International Socialism Journal, you'll read an article there by Paul O'Flynn, very learned article indeed, but learned for me, I may say, but really arguing there that a whole lot of what Orwell had to say, particularly about Spain, fits closely into our tradition. Now, I want to do something a little bit different today. I don't want just to see, whether Orwell was one of us, although that'll be part of it. What I want to do, I wanted it to be called 1984, is I want to see what it was that Orwell said that we could get from him, and also perhaps what it is that he posthumously could get from us in 1984, living in the year of the title of his most famous book. What is it that he's got to contribute to us, and what is it that we've got to contribute to him? Now, Orwell was born in Bengal. His father worked in the opium department of the India office. I'll repeat that because people sometimes don't really believe it. He worked in the opium department of the India office, rather similar to someone saying that he works in the heroin department of the Department of Health and Social Security. But it's very important to understand about British imperialism in India that the centre of it was at the beginning, destruction of the agriculture of Bengal in order that the soil could be made proper for the preparation of opium to sell to the Chinese. That was, as it were, the centrepiece of white Christian civilization in that part of the world. And it was ironic that Orwell's father, if you wanted to get on in the India office, in the India department or in the Indian government, it was quite a feather in your cap to say, well, I'm in the opium department. I'm a very important person indeed. Symbolic, really, of what British imperialism meant in the Indian subcontinent. And Orwell was very quickly to come to grips with that. He went to a terrible prep school private prep school, which he described very rigorously, and then of course he went to Eton. He describes a situation in Eton at the end of his time there, when there were 16 boys in the class, and they were asked to name the 10 most important people living at that time. 15 out of 16 named Lenin. Now, that you would have thought would have had a profound effect upon what those boys might have done when they left Eton. But the situation then, whether or not you thought Lenin was important, was the same then as it is now for people who go to Eton. Their jobs are safe, their life is safe. If they're clever, they go to university. If they're not so clever, they go to university. If they're backward, they go into the army, and if they're retarded, they go into the church. Orwell wasn't so clever at that time. He, I think, was 138th out of 151, and he therefore went into the army, or its equivalent, which was at the time the Burmese police, where he had these connections with the Indian subcontinent. I think you'd probably call it the Ronald Merrick Brigade today, that he went into, and very quickly came face to face with the reality of what British imperialism was about in Burma. We talk about it now because we don't really remember it. He was there for 4 years, from 1922 to 1927. And in that time, it's an astonishing figure, there were 612 hangings of Burmese people who protested in one way or another about British imperialism. 612, that's about 3 a week over a period of 4 years. And Orwell, in his capacity as police officer, saw rather a lot of this and was shocked by it all his life. Indeed, one of the things he's got to contribute to us is a consistent detestation of British imperialism, which goes right the way through his life, right the way through all his ups and downs and optimisms and pessimisms. He wrote a book called Burmese Days. Even those poor bloody fools at the club might be better company if we weren't all of us living a lie the whole time. The lie that we're here to uplift our poor black brothers instead of to rob them. He hated it. He hated the British in Burma. He hated his fellow policemen most of all. And as soon as he got home on leave, he resigned from the police force. And for many years, he was plunged in a sort of guilt, which you see keep coming out all the time in his writing about what had happened in Burma. It made him into what he thought was a socialist. He said he was a socialist. He said that he didn't like the society, and he had heard, in the way in which you do if you go to public school, and I speak from great experience here, he had heard about the working classes. You see, the ruling class always refers to the working class as the working classes. There are lots of them, all jumbled up. They're all equally horrible. But nevertheless, they are classes rather than one class, which has rather sinister connotations. At any rate, he had heard about the working classes, but he'd never seen any. You don't, you know, in Eton you never see any. What he'd seen was tramps and beggars and winos in the street. Couldn't help but observe them just walking around the streets in the late 1920s, anywhere in the country, but particularly in London. And he thought, of course, that these are the working classes that he'd heard about. And therefore, because he was a doer, an actor, somebody who wanted to do things rather than just think about them, he thought, well, I better go and find out what it's all about. And so he did, quite extraordinary way, become a tramp, a wino, somebody who hung around the streets with no money at all and lived in doss houses and worked in restaurants both in London and in Paris, and produced a very fine book called Down and Out in London and Paris, which describes all these terrible things that are happening right in the gutter of society, literally in the gutter of society, without really coming into contact with the people that he'd heard about, and in a sense wanted to contact in some way these working classes that he'd read about at Eton. And he didn't come into contact with them really until he was commissioned. He worked in a bookshop and did some teaching. And he didn't really come into contact with them until he was commissioned to write a book about the condition of the English working class. That was the original title. It has a much more famous pedigree, as of course you know. But to write a book about the condition of the English working class in the north. And he travelled for the first time north and went and lived among working class people and saw how they lived and described how they lived and worked in his first really great book, which is The Road to Wigan Pier. Now, these descriptions are still very valuable to us. The descriptions, perhaps, and I emphasise, I'm speaking about things that happened in 1984, because that's about the things that are going on in 1984, but those are the things that seem to me the most important. But he met the miners and described in the most graphic detail what it was like to be a miner, a thing that shocked him to his roots. The description is good enough, but the conclusion is even better, something that is as useful today as anything that you'd want to read about the miners anywhere, any place. More than anyone else, perhaps, the miner can stand as the type of a manual worker. Not only because his work is so exaggeratedly awful, but also because it is so vitally necessary and yet so remote from our experience, so invisible, as it were, that we are capable of forgetting it as we forget the blood in our veins. In a way, it is even humiliating to watch coal miners working. It raises in you a momentary doubt about your own status as an intellectual and a superior person generally. For it's brought home to you, at least while you're watching, that it's only because miners sweat their guts out that superior persons can remain superior. You and I, and the editor of the Times Literary Supplement, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Comrade X, author of Marxism for Infants, all of us really owe the comparative decency of our lives to poor drudges underground, blackened to the eyes, with their throats full of coal dust, driving their shovels forward with arms and belly muscles of steel. That's how he described the miners in The Road to Wigan Pier, and the description comes to us just as relevant to us, crucial to us, in all the propaganda we make about miners today. But there's a strange gap in the book. It's almost as though there's a sort of hiatus, as if you come to a bridge and don't cross it because the bridge isn't there. You get a real feeling of the conditions that workers lived in, the dreadful conditions in their houses, the dreadful conditions in the places that they worked. You get a real feeling of the warmth and decency of working class people as opposed to the people among whom Orwell had moved up to that time. But you get no feeling at all throughout the whole book of their strength and their power, no feeling of the collective action which can change those conditions. Now people say, well, of course there weren't any strikes in the 1930s, it's a bad time. Not true. People always think, oh, it's a downturn. There weren't any strikes, there was nothing happening. Curious thing is that as Orwell was writing this book, in which the miners play such a prominent part, as he was describing what miners do and seeing how important it was, the things that they were doing, there was a strike starting, just as he was preparing to write his book. One of the biggest strikes of the 1930s at Harworth Colliery in Nottingham, which is featured in the news quite recently, quite importantly, a strike to do with the formation of a breakaway union from the Federation of Mine Workers. It was a very, very long and brutal and tough strike, and the first 2 or 3 months of it took place while Orwell was writing this book, and yet there isn't a single reference to that strike, nor indeed to any other strike, nor indeed to the way in which trade unions operate, nor indeed to how the relationship between the trade union leadership and the rank-and-file workers. All these things were, as it were, out of his ken, something that he either hadn't discovered or refused to discover. He showed no interest at them all. And there's a relevance of this gap in Orwell's writing. It isn't just that we can say, ha-ha, we can see, missed out on the struggle, missed out on the collective spirit, wrong again, George, bad luck. Pity you didn't meet one of us at the time. It's more important than that. I think it comes when you see it, he discusses the whole politics of the 1930s, and you see the importance of the gap when it comes to his political analysis. See, he says this, for instance, in the last part of his book. He writes about, first bit is descriptive, the second bit is what we can do about it, and of course he's interested in socialism and getting socialism, and he says this: And it's very relevant today. In fact, it's an absolute accurate account exactly of what's going on. A generation ago, let's say 10 years, I never know how long a generation is, but let's say 10 years for the purposes of ramming this into the pattern. A generation ago, every intelligent person was, in some sense, a revolutionary. Nowadays, it would be nearer the mark to say that every intelligent person is a reactionary. Now, if you take that generation, when he says a generation ago, he means when he was a young man in the 1920s, early 1920s, it seemed to him that every intelligent person, by which of course he means every middle-class person, because he didn't know anybody else, was a revolutionary. Lenin had Eton. Who's important? Lenin, even at Eton. Didn't make any difference to their lives, but they thought. They were interested in it. They took some concern about what was going on in Russia. 1930s, exactly the opposite. Now, that's very relevant to us today, isn't it? I mean, in terms of the middle class people generally, just taking them in a bulk. I remember in the early 1970s going around with Roger Rosewall, who absolutely loved this kind of thing, went around with Roger Rosewall to rich middle-class people trying to get money for the International Socialists. And we go and see all kinds of people. The names would be quite extraordinary to repeat them now. Paul Johnson was one of them, I remember. But we went to see all kinds of people, all of whom were fantastically interested in what was going on in the revolution. Tell us about the revolution. People would stop their Volvo cars and jump out and say, what is this about the revolution? I remember Jim Nichol coming in, when I'd just gone to work at Socialist Worker, coming in, a cheque for £17,000 with a letter from somebody in the north saying, here, comrade, is the inheritance I have received today. I renounce my inheritance and declare my solidarity with International Socialism. This was widespread. The middle class, like a weathercock, in the society, blowing with the wind. At that time, as the horses in the 1920s, were fantastically interested. 1930s, they weren't. 1980s, they're not. They hate us. All of these people that gave us money, give it back. Where's my inheritance? All over the society, you have people all over the universities, places like that, tremendous drift to the right. The middle class is not with us today, not even a sprinkling of them really moving in our direction. That is something that stopped. The change that he noticed in 1920s, 1930s is the same as it is now. And there's a conundrum, a riddle about it, which he kept putting to himself, he couldn't really understand. It was a question, this question. What I'm concerned with is the fact that socialism is losing ground exactly where it ought to be gaining it. With so much in its favour, for every empty belly there is an argument for socialism, the idea of socialism is less widely accepted than it was 10 years ago. The average thinking person nowadays is not merely not a socialist, he is actively hostile to socialism. Again, I mean when he says the average thinking person, he's still thinking of those people in polite society in London, but nevertheless, there's a truth in it, isn't there? Now today, there's this conundrum, this riddle. I mean, there is capitalist society in the 1930s and in the 1980s, utterly bankrupt. There are people stacked up with starvation. All the time, more and more starvation. All the time, more and more unemployment. The system completely unable to cope with its problems and its crises. The argument for a different kind of system, for planning the economy, for meeting production with need, all these elementary arguments, quite obviously stronger when reflected against the facts, the objective facts of the society, than they were 10 years ago. And they were either in the 1970s or comparing the 1930s to the 1920s. There is circumstances in which you would expect, and all expects, the movement for socialism to grow. There more and more people to become socialist because the argument was so plain, and yet the opposite was happening. Orwell said to himself, now, let's address ourselves to that problem as an intellectual. Let's look at the problem and see why it is that with such powerful arguments, less and less people are accepting it. How we can do that, how we can come to that conclusion is, the reason is that they are confused by socialists. They don't like socialists, that's the problem. And socialists, and he leads his famous attack in the road to Wigan pier, the famous attack on socialists. Socialists are people who drink carrot juice. I mean, you probably know the passage. People who have large bottoms and walk around in shorts and all kinds of weirdos and loons and so on. Now, you know, this is often cited as being quite funny because it does describe people that we know who are a bit odd. And we think this is very good. You know, and sometimes you see it cited. Sometimes it's all right. What's happening? Carry on. Sometimes you see it cited as an example of, I don't know, dealing with middle-class socialists. Wasn't he funny about middle-class socialists? Wasn't it a joke that these things that he said about carrot juice and fat bottoms, and didn't it accurately describe the ILP at the time? Now, I think that's a deflection, comrades. I think it's a mistake, because really the fundamental mistake was to believe that the downturn, the reason why individual sabotage. There I go on. The reason why people had abandoned the ideas of socialism was because the socialists were so distasteful. And if only we could drink good beer instead of carrot juice and thin down our bums and perhaps start talking in a bit slightly better language, which is one of the things that he particularly stressed, then really that would change. Socialists would appeal more strongly to the people they were trying to get to. That was the problem. That was how you had to get round it. It obviously was not the problem. I go on a little bit. There are, I believe, and this shows how wrong the problem is, this comes from the same book, there are, I believe, countless people who, without being aware of it, are in sympathy with the essential aims of socialism and who could be won over almost without a struggle if only one could find the word that would move them. Now, that reminds me very much of the militant tendency. Now, go debate with the militant tendency in the old days when they would debate with us. Now they won't have us on the platform. But in the days when they would have us on the platform, they developed a theory of socialism which was founded on what I call the fruit machine notion. The fruit machine notion is based on the idea that you pull a lever. That's what you do, I think, with fruit machines, isn't it? You pull a lever and apples come up in the right order. And if they come up in the right order, boom, the cash comes out. Now that their notion, I often used to think their notion about the working class not being socialist, because they hadn't got a program. Do you remember that? They hadn't got a program. And if only we could fit in 300 nationalised companies, troops out of Ireland, a few other things in the slot machine and pull the thing, somehow or other the revolution would come. And this is what he says, this thing about if only one could find the word that would move them, if only one could find the right word, we'll be able to galvanise the masses. It very, very much reminds me of that kind of thinking. And again, it reverts back to the gap in that book, the hiatus that exists in that book. Because the real reasons for the downturn in the 1930s were very, very similar to the real reasons for the downturn in the 1980s. The real underlying causes were roughly the same. 1920s, the reason for it could be summed up in two words, really: general strike. 1926, catastrophe. Slaughter for the miners, breakdown of the trade union movement, general lack of confidence, going on and leading to mass unemployment in the early 1930s. Those are the things which cause people to lose their confidence. In other words, this lack of knowledge of the workers' strength leads him away from any understanding of what it was that created the conditions for socialism, or the thinking about socialism. What people do in the working class, how they act, how they direct themselves, how they organise, have to do with how they think. And when they don't feel confident enough to do things, or they don't do things, and they don't use their power and strength, their confidence goes. It vanishes. And as their confidence vanishes, so their belief and confidence in socialist ideas also vanishes. The two things go at the same time. In other words, that connection between the movement of the class, these shimmering ups and downs, as the class moves up and down, that connection was lost to him when he talked about the miners, lost to him when he talked about the other workers, and therefore lost to him when it came to a solution. what to do about it had to do with socialists getting into longs and not shorts, wearing sports jackets, ties, and looking ordinary and decent and not looking crummy and cranky, and that was the way in which you could change it, as though that would really have made any great difference to the downturn of the 1930s. He refused to accept this connection between the confidence of the working class and their strength, and that is the great gap that exists in the road to Wigan Pier and leads to really him into the sort of wildernesses which exist at the end of that book. And if that had been the end of it, in other words, if Orwell was a theoretician, someone who just thought things, really he would have stewed in that book. And we wouldn't be discussing him today. He wouldn't be relevant. We wouldn't have articles in International Socialism Journal and Socialist Review about him. But he wasn't just a theoretician, that's the point about him. He was a doer, he did things. And then he watched what was happening in the world, he saw what was going on in Spain, he saw the fascist attack on Spain and the revolution that took place in whole areas of Spain as a result of that, and his immediate instinct was to do something about it. And here is a scene in a critical paper in London, rather nice, middle class, following the policies of social credit, with which I'm sure you're all absolutely familiar. And here is the editor sitting behind his desk and this great shambling figure coming in with a rucksack saying, "I'm sorry, can't write my column this week, I'm off to Spain." "Why are you off to Spain?" "This fascism thing, it's got to be stopped." And he's going to stop it. Now, Orwell arrived in revolutionary Barcelona in December 1936, and he spent 6 months in Spain fighting fascists. And he chronicled those 6 months in what is, beyond any question at all, the greatest book he wrote, his greatest writing, Homage to Catalonia. If there is anyone here who has not read Homage to Catalonia, then that is something about which you should be deeply ashamed, and something you should... But if there's anyone here who has read 1984 or Animal Farm and has not read Homage to Catalonia, then that is a catastrophe. That is something, by the way, which you can immediately put right by going to the bookshop afterwards. But the Homage to Catalonia is a really magnificent book. It starts, I saw Paul O'Flynn in International Socialism Journal confessing that he was pulled out of Oxfam Quakerism by reading the first 3 pages of Homage to Catalonia. And I remember, as the president of the Oxford University Liberal Club, 24 years ago, comrades, I hope you're all laughing in 24 years. 24 years ago, picking up this book, and just on the 3rd page reading this, I had exactly the same effect on me as on Paul O'Flynn, and I think on probably many others of you here, and I hope perhaps even some of you who haven't read it. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers, and was draped with red flags or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with a hammer and sickle and with the initials of revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burned. Churches, here and there, were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivised. Even the bootblacks had been collectivised and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shopkeepers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said senor or don or even usted. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou and said salud instead of buenos dias. Tipping was forbidden by law. Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from the hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. There were no private motor cars, they'd all been commandeered. And all the trams and taxis and much of the other transport were painted red and black. The revolutionary posters were everywhere, flaming from the walls in clean reds and blues that made the few remaining advertisements look like daubs of mud. Down the Ramblas, the wide central artery of the town, where crowds of people streamed constantly to and fro, the loudspeakers were bellowing revolutionary songs all day and far into the night. And it was the aspect of the crowds that was the queerest of all. In outward appearance, it was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes, or blue overalls, or some variant of the militia uniform. All this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I didn't understand. In some ways I didn't even like it. But I realized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. That image and that picture goes on and on in the book. Bear with me, I'll just read one more passage when he goes to the front itself. I think this is probably some of the finest revolutionary writing in our literature, if not the finest, and this describes his experience on the front fighting the fascists with the militia. However much one cursed at the time, one realized afterwards that one had been in contact with something strange and valuable. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. I'm well aware that it's now the fashion to deny that socialism has anything to do with equality. In every country in the world, a huge tribe of party hacks and sleek little professors are busy proving that socialism means no more than a planned state capitalism with the grab motive left intact. But fortunately there also exists a vision of socialism quite different from this. The thing that attracts ordinary people to socialism and makes them willing to risk their skins for it, the mystique of socialism, is the idea of equality. To the vast majority of people, socialism means a classless society, or it means nothing at all. And it was here that those few months in the militia were valuable to me. For the Spanish militias, while they lasted, were a sort of microcosm of a classless society. In that community where no one was on the make, where there was a shortage of everything but no privilege and no bootlicking, one got perhaps a crude forecast of what the opening stages of socialism might be like. And after all, instead of disillusioning me, it deeply attracted me. The effect was to make my desire to see socialism established much more actual than it had been before. It filled the gap that was in the road to Wigan pier, and it filled it not just metaphorically, but it filled it literally. He wrote this: the way in which the working class in the democratic countries could really have helped their Spanish comrades was by industrial action, strikes and boycotts. Now I know there are some Orwell scholars here and people have their tape recorders out who know all about Orwell, but I have read, I think, most of Orwell, and I don't remember a single other reference in any of his work to strikes or boycotts, particularly to strikes. That is the reference. And that is the reference that comes at a time when he sees the working class not only in action, but in control. And when he sees them in action and control, the cobwebs of the kind of socialism that he described and talked about in the road to Wigan pier are wiped clean. Not only are the cobwebs wiped clean, but the politics of the situation becomes stark and clear. He writes about the Spanish situation, thinking that he'd gone, don't forget, to fight a war against fascism for republicanism. He writes, as he comes back from Spain itself, the real struggle is between revolution and counter-revolution, between the workers who are vainly trying to hold on to a little of what they won in 1936 and the liberal communist bloc who are so successfully taking it away from them. It is unfortunate that so few people in England have yet caught up with the fact that communism is now a counter-revolutionary force, that communists everywhere are in alliance with bourgeois reformism and using the whole of their powerful machinery to crush or discredit any party that shows signs of revolutionary tendencies. Now that is in 1937, comrades. That's perhaps part of our tradition, if anything is. And that's in 1937, long before most people were aware of it. And the reason that he was aware of it was that he'd seen the successful revolution. And all those, every day of the 6 months that he spent in Spain, he could see the effect of the counter-revolution on what he'd seen. What mattered to him was that the wonderful image of Barcelona, which he saw when he arrived, was gradually changed in front of his eyes. When he went back there on leave, it was a different city. There were wealthy people in the streets. The expressions of deference had begun to grow back into people's mouths. People were beginning to bow and scrape. The thing was changing, and it was changing by the deliberate act of a liberal government backed up by the communists. The thing that shook him to his roots. When he'd gone there, he was quite prepared to go and fight in the International Brigade alongside the other communists. He knew that the communists perhaps had supplied more, definitely had supplied far more fighters in the International Brigade than any other section. But when he got there, he saw how the communists were league with the Liberal Alliance, with the Liberal government, in order to destroy the revolution, to take it away. And that was the problem, because it wasn't just fascism that was a problem, because the whole business of fighting fascism, and he describes it in that book, the whole business of fighting fascism, the discipline that exists in the line, the revolutionary discipline which gets people to do things because they believe in it, that never orders anybody to do anything, that doesn't have hierarchies or badges of rank, but expects volunteers to come forward, as they did consistently and constantly during the 6 months that he was there, come forward for the most daring and horrible things, expects them to come forward because they are part of a movement. Under those circumstances, fascism could be beaten with sleek, well-equipped armies, provided with, well-equipped with weapons from Russia, and well-equipped as proper, with all the ranks and insignia of ranks that existed. Fascism couldn't be beaten. These things were crucial. The problem was the revolution against the counter-revolution had to be defended. And when the events took place in May, he was with the POUM, he was with desperately trying to keep away the counter-revolution, and of course failing to do it. Now, the thing that struck him was not really so much that the Liberal government was against revolution. He might have predicted that. But the thing that struck him, and struck him all the way through the rest of his life, almost every day of it, was this business of the Communist Party allying themselves with the counter-revolution. It is not a nice thing to see a Spanish boy of 15 carried down the line on a stretcher with a dazed white face looking out from under the blankets, and to think of the sleek persons in London and in Paris who are writing pamphlets to prove that this boy is a fascist in disguise. They were liars and cheats, and they were defaming the revolutionaries all down the line, and he saw that they were defaming them. The most powerful chapter in the book is the one where he deals with the argument sensibly, in an almost Etonian fashion. Let's look at it objectively. Are the fascists paying the Trotskyists? Are they? Is it true that the Trotskyists are in the fascist pay? He says one thing which surprises me is that if the Trotskyists are in fascist pay, why don't they ever have any money? That's the one curious thing. But he deals with it factually, pointing out not only were they not under fascist pay, no need to really go into it in any great length, not only were they not receiving fascist pay, but they were the most bitter opponents and the most effective opponents of the fascists. And the counter-revolution, although he didn't predict it at the time, the counter-revolution effectively destroyed the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War and established fascism there for 40 or 50 years. Now, ever since then, the fury of double-dealing hypocrisy of the communists moved him all his life. It's impossible really to appreciate all the things that Orwell wrote unless you understand that fact, how deeply he was enraged by the role of the communists in Spain. The only other thing that I've seen similar to it, apart from perhaps some of the formal texts, but similar to the passion that comes out of him about it, is the book by Victor Serge, The Case of Comrade Tulayev, the 5th section of it, which deals with revolutionary Spain and the role of the communists in that. Serge and Orwell had a great deal in common with each other and with us, and they both detected with passion and with the tremendous descriptive powers just what it meant when you found that the people who were meant to be at the very centre of the revolution were the people who were destroying it, and how all the people all over the world calling themselves communists and believing themselves to be part of a revolutionary process were in fact part of a machine that was destroying that revolutionary process. Well, when he came back from Spain, he joined the ILP. Now, the ILP hardly existed. It was a rump. He joined it just because he thought he ought to join something, he didn't know what else he could join. And he doesn't seem to have had any part of any party, or even of that party, during any a part of his life. But his politics were very much to the left of the ILP. He continued all the way through those late 30s, 38 and 39, tirades against what he called the anti-fascist racket. He wrote to Herbert Reed in January 1939, "I believe it is vitally necessary for those of us who intend to oppose the coming war to start organising for illegal anti-war activities." And his vision of society then was imperialist war, people fighting each other, all with interests which no socialist could defend, a gradual dictatorial move to dictatorship in all the different countries, and the few socialists that opposed it going into underground, illegally, fighting, perhaps actually fighting, against their government in the interests of the workers all over the world. That was his position in 1938 and 39. But of course, as soon as war broke out, he did change it. Not only him, by the way, not only him. I was talking to Cliff the other day. I was asking him, what were you during the war? Revolutionary defeatist. I've never been ashamed of it, and we're proud of that. You know, I was 5. I didn't have a role. I wasn't even in the Liberal Club. Very few people here remember. Frank Henderson's here. He was a revolutionary defeatist all through the war. Duncan Hallis or something else, although we don't want to go into this too much. But the point is that there were only a few, very small handful of people managed to maintain that very, very hard line throughout the period of the war. Almost everyone on the left went over to some kind of defensism, to some kind of support for the war. Right over, if you were in the Communist Party, you were absolutely mad for the war, hysterical for the war, wonderful war that was being fought. And as you moved further left, so the enthusiasm for the war effort actually declined. Now, Orwell went over to the war. He wrote, yes, series of articles, brought on one of these collected works, My Country, Right or Left. And that was his position, and he was quite frank about it, appalling though it may sound now. But I think this is important, that all the way through the war, really, he never lost that vision of Barcelona. He never lost his belief in the working class, and he never really collapsed into chauvinism or jingoism or any of the rubbish that was coming from the Communist Party and other sections of the left. That rifle hanging on the wall of the working class flat or labourer's cottage is the symbol of democracy, he wrote in the middle of the war. It is our job to see that it stays there. Now that is not the writing of some bourgeois reformist, you know, that rifle. You keep it. The Home Guard, why well, I'm in the Home Guard, I'm in the Home Guard to get as many rifles into the houses of working class people as I possibly can. Here he's writing in Tribune, amazing, Tribune. It is only by revolution that the English can be set free. That is in Tribune. That is the only time that sentiment has ever appeared in Tribune. And as he saw the communists snuggle up closer to the Tories, see, it's difficult to imagine it in a way, looking back on it now, but you have to see it as it was then. The communists and the Tories snuggling up to one another. The Communist Party never wanted the Labour to fight the 1945 election. They wanted the coalition to continue. They were worried that Labour wouldn't win it, or they were worried that Labour would win it. I'm not sure what they were worried about, but they didn't want an election. And when the election did come, they put out pamphlets saying, vote, you know, in some cases for progressive Tories. Election. They wanted the coalition to continue. They were worried that Labour wouldn't win it, or they were worried that Labour would win it. I'm not sure what they were worried about, but they didn't want an election. And when the election did come, they put out pamphlets saying, vote, you know, in some cases for progressive Tories, like Churchill and Eden and so on. But as he saw this alliance continue towards the end of the war, he got more and more furious at it. In particular, he singled out Poland. I mean, I'm trying to take the things out that are relevant to us today. He said, look, the rape of Poland. You go to Tehran, or you go to Yalta, or you go to Potsdam, all these people, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, people of that kind, are dividing up the world. Where is your support for Poland? You were against the fascist invasion of Poland. You were against the annexation of Poland then. Why are you not against them now? He railed against them, banged against them, constantly exposed the double standard which they represented. And at the same time, it's very important, at the same time, never lost his position, never allowed himself to slide to the right. This is very important because people say, yes, those figures you gave at the beginning of 1984 represent the American government the British government, capitalism, international capitalism, sanctioning this book, both in their all university examinations and the like, and promoting it. Didn't he just slide over as another cold warrior? Answer, no, he did not. And we're talking of different times. The Duchess of Athol, who was a Tory, you'll be surprised to hear, wrote and asked him to speak at an anti-Russian meeting. He replied, November 1945, I cannot associate myself with an essentially conservative body which claims to defend democracy in Europe but has nothing to say about British imperialism. It seems to me that one can only denounce the crimes now being committed in Poland, Yugoslavia, etc., if one is equally insistent on ending Britain's unwanted rule in India. I belong to the left and must work inside it. And he went on against race prejudice against the Germans. He was absolutely opposed to the anti-German prejudice. There's a very curious little correspondence in these letters, where somebody writes in, meant to be friendly, writes in the Tribune saying, well, I, like you, want the Hun to be beaten. I want the Hun to be beaten. And he wrote this. Now, it seems to me that you do less harm by dropping bombs on people than by calling them Huns. War damages the fabric of civilization, not by the destruction it causes, but by stimulating hatred. Now, that's obviously rubbish. I mean, that's perverse, isn't it? I mean, it is perverse to say that you do less damage to someone by calling him or her a Hun than by dropping a bomb. I mean, that is wrong. I mean, plainly wrong. But the perversity is, you see him saying, is that I'd rather drop the bombs. I'd rather drop the bombs on them than have any racial divisions come out here that poison right for future wars, reparations, and all the like. He maintained that feeling that the Germans were people just like anyone else. The German workers were workers like anyone else. He maintained it. In spite of his position on the war, he didn't slide right over into what we now know, but which wasn't then, I emphasize it, which wasn't then, Cold War rhetoric. But his preoccupation remained the same. And we're lucky in a way that it did. The preoccupation remained the same. Russia. What Russia did in Spain, what the Russian government did in Spain and all through those periods of the purges of the people who opposed them, how the Russian government dealt with opposition, how the Russian government dealt with working class organization. It was his preoccupation, and no one else, and almost no one else's preoccupation was at this time. The destruction of the Soviet myth is essential if we want the revival of the socialist movement. This room, comrades, is tribute to that. Nothing more tribute to that. When I started out, the thing that mattered, most of all, the question kept coming back on socialism all the time. What about Russia? Still happens. Go back to Russia. Not so much now. There's not even a blind idiot can see there's no connection between Russia and socialism now. But still, they do say it. And still it's the argument, even today, the fact that he was identifying it in 1945 is absolutely crucial to understanding it. See that? It was that aim, it was that inspiration which led him to write these two books, these two last books, which are by far the most famous, these two satires on the Russian model, 1984 and Animal Farm, or in the other order, in time order. Animal Farm 1945, 1984, published in 1948, although written in 1947. They are on the Russian model. I don't go along with the people who say, oh, you know, it was really all bureaucracy that he was against. I mean, you only have to read the books again, and thank God for Skegness that it does make you read the books again. Makes you read them again. I read them again, and there's no question at all about Animal Farm, obviously. No question about 1984 in my belief at all. It is on the Russian model. Even the names are similar. Goldstein for Bronstein. There's no question that Goldstein, the figure in 1984, internationalism coming out once more, by the way, his hatred of anti-Semitism, his hero is a Jew, but the names Goldstein and Bronstein are too similar not to believe that that Goldstein is a Trotsky figure in 1984. It is on the Russian model. And it is important to say it again, that these books are not written at the time of the Cold War as we now know it. I mean, maybe he should have foreseen it, but in the time that was there, 1945, 1946, 1947, it was not a Cold War time. This was a time when Stalinist Russia, conservative Britain, conservative, or later Labour Britain, I'll come to that in a minute, but Stalinist Russia and the conservatives in Britain and the conservatives in the United States of America were coming together, it seemed to him, and rightly seemed to him, as we now know it, although precious few people knew it then, to suppress the aspirations, the rising aspirations of the working class people where he placed his allegiance. He was, and it's also important this, that the working class is still here. I mean, these are pessimistic books, I agree. I mean, Paul O'Flynn, a terrific attack on 1984, you can read it afterwards. The working class is still in this book. This 750,000 copies going around, it is still there, it's passive, it's back to the passivity of the Road to Wigan Pier, and it's rather dull and obscure and in some ways insulted, but they're there all right, and they're not just there mentioned in passing, they're there as the only hope of civilization. If there is hope, wrote Winston, it lies in the proles. If there was no hope, it must lie in the proles. If there was hope, it must lie in the proles, because only there, in those swarming disregarded masses, could the force to destroy the party be generated. Party, of course, representing bureaucracy and power. And unless the same riddle and conundrum which had bothered him in the Road to Wigan Pier comes out again. He's writing. Remember Winston Smith writing in the corners away from the television screens, trying to work it out for himself. The book isn't the way in which many people write about it. There are whole elements of this attempting to come to grips, how can we change it, writing it down there, writing the sentence, unless they become conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. Say it again. Unless they become conscious, they will never rebel. But until after they've rebelled, they cannot become conscious. Awful catch-22. An awful catch-22 which leaves out the fact that the rebellion is going on all the time in the struggle. Same gap that existed there in the Road to Wigan Pier. He'd never seen he'd seen a successful revolution or the ending of a successful revolution, but he'd never seen or really fitted into the struggle. And therefore, but he is forced back to argue. How do we get the consciousness? How do we get the proles off their backs? How do we get them moving? How do we turn their strength into consciousness and mingle the consciousness with the strength? That's the problem, and that catch-22 situation seemed to exist there. Here's the bit that I think is that, apart from it being just casual, I think it's the central piece in 1984, just before Winston and Julia are taken away by the police and smashed to pieces in the torture chambers. Just before that happens, the very climax of the book, in my belief, the future belonged to the proles. This is Smith thinking. And could he be sure that when the time came, the world they constructed would not be just as alien to him, Winston Smith, as the world of the party? Yes, because at the least, it would be a world of sanity. Where there is equality, there can be sanity. Sooner or later it would happen. Strength would change into consciousness. The proles were immortal. You could not doubt it even when he looked at that valiant figure in the yard. And then he goes on to talk about how it may take 1,000 years to happen, but it'll happen in the end, that they will come into it. Now, 1,000 years, comrades, is too long for me. I'm not going to wait 1,000 years. I think the future lies with the proles, not waiting 1,000 years, and I'm not putting up with any Central Committee document which comes around perspectives for the next 1,000 years. I'm not doing any of that. It is very pessimistic. It doesn't have the strength. It's lost the strength. The strength of Barcelona's gone out, and the weakness and passivity of Wigan Pier is still there. I'll just make this point finally in his defence, and some say it's said in defence of the book. See, if Orwell was just a social democrat, a left social democrat, like Bernard Crick says in his, on the whole, very good biography that he's written recently, written in 1980 actually, if he was just a social democrat, left, tribunite, somebody who wanted the left of the Labour Party to triumph. And if, as is certainly the case, 1984 is an extremely pessimistic book, why did he write it then? See, if you were a social democrat, in 1947, if you were someone who thought that the election of Labour governments is what matters, and even if you were someone who thought that the election of Labour governments would lead to things happening,
Suppose you were that sort of person. There are precious few here, probably none. But if you were that sort of person, 1947 was the summer. It was the high peak, everything. If you were a Stalinist in 1947, things were good. Things were looking up. They'd taken over the whole of Stalinism was rampant throughout Eastern Europe. They'd imposed it by bayonets throughout 6 countries in Eastern Europe. It seemed to be a very, very powerful force with fantastic influence. But the point is, if you were a Labour person, a left Labour person, a supporter of Aneurin Bevan in 1947, then that was a great time. That was terrific. Usually everything would seem to be bursting with activity and life. All those nationalisation acts, 1946, 1947, Industrial Injury Act, National Health Service on the agenda, Labour government with a majority of 145, Aneurin Bevan in the cabinet, just come over from Tribune to the cabinet, and Aneurin Bevan sponsored all articles in Tribune during the whole of the late 40s. Things were great. It was wonderful. That was a great time to be a social democrat. You felt, the most obscure question of all is why should write such an utterly gloomy book about the oncoming totalitarianism if he was a left tribunite? If he was a tribunite, he should have been dancing in the streets. Great, we've got it, we're there. Reason he wrote it was not just, in my belief, that he hated the Russians, which he did. He hated the Communist Party, and that this hatred had obscured his belief in working class power. I think that he sensed, long before most other people did, when most other people weren't feeling it, I think he sensed in a vague sort of way that this Labour government, this Labourism, this great wet blanket coming and covering the whole of the working class movement, keep down, shut up, wait till elections, then you can come up for a little bit, and then for Christ's sake get back in your holes again, don't do anything after the election, keep quiet, don't think, don't agitate, don't talk, for Christ's sake don't go on strike, and if we go on strike we'll smash it to pieces. All these things happened in the 1945-51 government, and capitalism was reasserted after fantastic aspirations had grown up as a result of the war. I think he sensed it. I think he thought this Labour government is not a bulwark against oncoming totalitarianism. It is a possibility. You know, he said, I'm not writing against Russia for capitalism, I'm against capitalism. He put out 2 press releases immediately afterwards. The book came out, but it started to be praised in America, and all the McCarthyites, or the McCarthyites in embryo, started to get hold of the thing and praise it and say, this is the book for us. The fact that they could do it is a criticism of all, and the book is reactionary and pessimistic in many ways, but the reasons why he wrote it, I believe, have to do with the fact that the things he really believed in, which were the movements from below, the movements, the activity, the rank and file working class people, were being suppressed by the Labour government as they were by the rising Stalinism in Russia. And I think that's a question, in a sense, which the critics of these world never really come to answer. I just want to go back finally really to where I started and ask the question, what is it that he can give us, and what is it that we can give him, this great shambling old Etonian, this Trotskyist with big feet, as H.G. Wells called him? Well, one thing he hadn't got was something like what we've got here this afternoon, or what we've had here over the last couple of days. He hadn't got the collective, and the feeling of the collective, and the confidence which the collective gives you. He was a socialist, but he was not the sort of socialist who realized that you have to pool your abilities and resources if your abilities and resources are going to be of any use whatever, and that it is in collaboration and cooperation with others, connected with that other thing that he missed almost all his life except for those brief months in Barcelona, connected with the movement of the working class, the power that they have to change society, the collective of socialists connected up with that movement. He didn't have that. I think if he had that, he would have been a better writer. But I also think that it's quite pointless saying, oh, perhaps he would have been if he'd met the right person. I noticed John Deason says in his article, oh, if only he'd met Reg Groves when he was working in the bookshop, because Reg Groves went to work there. Well, actually, he did meet Reg Groves, and it didn't make any difference. I met Reg Groves doesn't necessarily make any difference. Meeting Reg Groves does not change your life. I mean, it's not true. It's silly to say, oh, poor old Orwell never came into contact with any decent Trotskyists and he blundered around. People do say that. I think that's silly. I think he was hostile, to be honest. There's plenty of evidence that he was hostile to quite a lot of of Trotskyism. I've got an example here, just in case, because people do say, oh, well, this doesn't happen. Yes. Sometimes, when I listen to these people talking, and still more when I read their books, I get the impression that to them the whole socialist movement is no more than a kind of exciting heresy hunt, a leaping to and fro of frenzied witch doctors to the beat of tom-toms and the tune of fee-fi-fo-fum, I smell the blood of a right-wing deviationist. I think he'd come in contact with us all right. See, we've got that to give him, and in a sense you can see the gaps easily enough. But the other question I asked, which is what he's got to give us, I think that's also a very important question too. See, we have a collective. I think sometimes people think that the collective is just a lot of people speaking with one voice. Now, it is a lot of people speaking with one voice, but it's very important that the one voice is divided into hundreds, if not thousands, of different accents and different languages. I think people sometimes think that being in a collective enables them to surrender their duty to think each subject through. And I think the great advantage of Orwell is that he thought everything through for himself. That's the first great advantage. That you can never convince anyone in argument, and we have no other way of convincing them, by the way. We don't in charge of media. I've been to 2 or 3 meetings already this weekend in which the word argument has been by far the greatest word used, the word used most, absolutely rightly. Argument's the only way we have, and you'll never convince anyone in argument unless they are convinced that you believe it, not that you're saying it because you heard someone else saying it, or that you're taking it by rote. And therefore the collective, if it's many, many different people, I mean, this is true of socialism just as it is for the fight for socialism. If socialism was the same as sameness, then there would be no point in fighting for it at all. If a socialist party was the same as sameness, there would be no point in fighting for it. The point is, we speak with one voice, but every one of us is different. And every one of us arrives at different conclusions at the conclusion for different reasons and in different ways. And the importance of thinking it through and arguing it through yourself is something I think that comes very, very clearly out of what Orwell has to say. The last thing that Trotsky said, before the axe went into his head, brought this bloody spy who'd come along with an article. And he'd written the article in terms which he thought Trotsky would approve of. He'd written it in a dull, sectarian language. And although it was correct from start to finish, Trotsky could immediately see the problem. And he turned, before he was executed, before he was assassinated, the first thing he said was, "Write plainly, comrade." Those were his last words. You've got to learn to write plainly. And I think this business of writing simply and not talking in absurd sectarian jargon, not the name-calling, the awful culture hunting which goes on with people who think somehow that because they're in the collective they can be aggressive and unpleasant about it without the independent thought coming out. All those things I think are terribly important coming out of Orwell. It's a great legacy which we've got from him. It's this sparkling clarity of his language. I said earlier that language wasn't the important thing in changing working class consciousness. Of course it's not the important thing, but it is definitely an important thing. Prose should be like a window pane. You should be able to see through language to its meaning. If you can't see through language and its meaning, it's absolutely appalling. It has a reverse effect. The more you talk in language which doesn't mean anything, the more people won't believe you because they believe you're getting it from someone else. That's what he says here. He's talking about Lasky, Harold Lasky, professor. And Lasky criticised T.S. Eliot for not writing English, and he quotes from Lasky. Here's a piece from Lasky, you might be interested in it. As a whole, our system was a compromise between democracy in the political realm, itself a very recent development in our history, and an economic power oligarchically organised, which was in its turn related to a certain aristocratic vestigia still able to influence profoundly the habits of our society. He says, this sentence, incidentally, comes from a reprinted lecture. So one must assume that Professor Lasky actually stood up on a platform and spouted it full, parenthesis and all. It is clear that people capable of speaking or writing in such a way have simply forgotten what everyday language is like. This is nothing to some of the other passages I could dig out of Professor Lasky's writing, or better still, from communist literature, or best of all, wait for it comrades, from Trotsky's pamphlets. Indeed, from reading the left-wing press, you get the impression that the louder people yap about the proletariat, the more they despise its language. I think we do have a lesson there, comrades. I think if we can learn our own language, to speak our own language more, we can cut away all the time from things that have been passed down to us, learn to think things through and talk ourselves as part of the collective, then we can start to blend a real language, a real communicating spirit with the people outside with the power that we already have, the power to change and the power to communicate. We've got one to contribute to him, he's got one to contribute to us, and let's hope that together we go forward to here. There's nothing we can't aim at, and nothing we can't achieve. Thank you very much.